like installing ramps and curb cuts in that same way that helping, like it's designed to specifically help one population with disabilities, but it really ends up benefiting everyone. In that same way, studying the neurodivergent population with cannabis will help everyone.
Welcome to Living in the Weeds, a series that explores the lived experiences of neurodivergent people who consume cannabis, with your hosts, Jessica of Jessica Riley Writer and Lucy of Lucy's Natural Remedies. Today's guest is Dr. Miyabe Shields. Miyabe has a Ph.D. in endocannabinoid pharmacology and describes themselves as a queer, neurodivergent stoner scientist.
So you mentioned a routine, like a cannabis routine for neurodivergence. Walk us all through an ideal day for you of combining your cannabis use, and if the terpenes that you prefer and the cannabinoid profiles that you prefer, and how that interacts with your day.
So at this point, my ideal routine changes depending on the demands of the day, and also depending on the context of how I felt either when I wake up or the night before. But where I started with this routine was just a dose schedule that was the same, consistency. So I was kind of the first place that I started, which is that I dose in the morning always. I change what it is now at this point. I've gotten to be more flexible with that, but that in the beginning, the biggest change for me was just that, I always dose in the morning. The endocannabinoid system tends to fall in the morning. There's studies that it follows cortisol. And so it's lowest right before we wake up in the morning. It's kind of the reason why some of the flare disorders will flare at that 3 a.m., witching hour sort of time when your endocannabinoid system could be at its lowest. And so I have found that dosing in the morning really helps my day. It's a very important time for me to be able to set up my day to be a good and productive and low anxiety and not stressful day. And that, the wake and bake has often been sort of stereotyped as this ultimate stoner thing. Oh, all these stoners who wake up first thing in the morning and they hit the bong.
A shout out real quick to all the wake and bakers. I was a wake and baker for decades, right? Until it was April of this year that my relationship with cannabis has drastically changed. But that's for a different day and story. I had a concussion. It was a problem. But so now I no longer have a need to wake and bake as much. But yeah, no, every day that was how I started. I couldn't have an appetite. My stress levels were at an ultimate high. I would snooze for an hour and a half straight without even thinking twice about it, because and I would fall back asleep each time for those 5-7 minutes. And it was once I started to get high in the morning, that was great. Once I started learning about the differences in the terpenes that were helping me stay awake and not crash immediately afterwards and fall asleep because I was accidentally smoking some, myrcene or linalool or something that kind of tends to be more of a sedative effect. Yeah, no, I'm with you. And I definitely dealt with the negative stereotypes of you smoke weed the first thing in the morning before you've eaten. I'm like, did you want me to eat breakfast? Because that's the only way that this is going to work today.
Yeah. So for me, that what you mentioned too, I struggled a lot with feeling that word drug addict was linked to this in the morning dosing, right? But then later on, when I put it in the pharmaceutical context, or when I applied pharmaceutical concepts to cannabis and had this context around it, we dose a lot of pharmaceuticals in the morning too, for the same reason that it makes sense to have it in your system in the day if it's helping you. And so, this is it's definitely something that I've learned. When you say the terpenes, I lean towards citrusy and light always anyways. That tends to be what my main desirable terpenes that I go for in flower are. So more the terpinolene, limonene, I like geraniol. I like the sweet, fruity, that kind of stuff. And I actually, honestly, I like everything because I also like trying different things.
Those
But
are all some of my favorite terpenes, and except for I can no longer do limonene now because as we were talking, like this chase for the high THC, like limonene is like the hot terpene right now in the Maryland scene, and I'm talking like up to 2% representation of limonene in there.
wow.
It triggers my anxiety and paranoia in a way that is like could be documented for the books because it's so extreme. To like now, I had like an entire eighth that I had just bought. And it had like 1.7% limonene in it. I gave it to a homeless man. I was just like, here, because he was like peddling, and I was like, I've always wanted to do this, and I literally can't, like, I can't give this to anybody. I'm just here, take it, sir. And like,
and it changes. Yeah, he's probably like, whoa.
And then I got all paranoid. I was like, oh God, what if he has the same endocannabinoid system that I do, and I just gave him a bottle of paranoia and anxiety? No.
Well, there's always the barter system, so hopefully that's like, but I mean also like so I tend to have that with piney, and I've seen that. Now I used to love piney smelling nugs, like, and part of what I think I agree with you is that I think it has to do with just like this over like saturation of it being like we're just going too much, and like it's like to say that like we should have less terpenes, like no, that's not like really what I'm saying, but I'm kind of saying it. Like I'm kind of saying that we should just like have this like more moderated like levels of everything. But I mean, so yeah, that the dosing thing, it's the dose schedule, I guess. Like when we say the word routine, like what we're really talking about in like a pharmaceutical sense would be like a dose and a dose schedule. So in general, I keep the dose in the morning low, and then I always do it. Like I wake up and I drink coffee. I have like the equivalent of what is 1 cup of coffee or 1 like double shot of espresso. I have some equivalent of caffeine in the morning, like whether it's tea or coffee or espresso, and then I smoke typically. And it's like a relatively low dose, and it's anywhere in the mornings from between like, I guess if I'm like measuring it in flour, like 1/4 gram of flour, like total. Something around there, something like 250 milligrams of flour. And it's usually mixed. Like my bread and butter is 40% CBG hemp, 40% CBD hemp, and 20% THC flour in like a little bit of a blend. And so that's kind of like my baseline in the mornings. If I'm feeling really up, if I'm feeling very anxious, I'll smoke only CBD hemp flour. And if I'm just feeling like I need more of like an anti-inflammatory effect, or if I'm feeling like I need more of like, I'm trying to think of why I I don't even know sometimes why I choose necessarily now, because my brain has automatically made those patterns where I'll wake up and I'll be like, today is a THC morning, and I'll just like go that route. And I'd say that like I lean and I play with my ratios sometimes also based on like what is easy. That also is true. Like sometimes it's like, okay, I keep a grinder that's 50-50 CBG and CBD flour at all times basically, and I'll just add THC flour into like whatever joint I roll, or if I'm packing like a one hitter or something. So that's how the morning is. And then like typically either like late afternoon, or like depending on what I'm doing that day, I'll take like a much larger dose at the point in the day when you're changing your task. That's kind of like what I would describe as like the next dosing time. And then towards the end of the day, towards the night, I would say like I probably in a day will go through like set like almost a gram, maybe like a gram or so of flour, maybe 2 grams, somewhere between that amount of total flour. Like, and this is joints, right? So joints are like vastly inefficient. So if it was like, because I also now I'm at the point where I'm a little snooty, and I'm like, oh, that's those roaches. Like, like I used to be like to the last like burn. I used to take out my roaches and re-roll them, right? Or
been there, done that.
pack just your roaches up and just like, you know, kind of like
from that is that was what the old school way was thinking, is like if you take all of your roaches and you rolled a giant joint from it, that you would end up being higher from that than the original.
I felt that. I mean, actually, we did this like study a year ago at the company that was about like differences in roaches, and like it made sense. The heavier terpenes stayed, like the roaches had more decarboxylation. There was more like it's a different profile by the time you get down there. I mean, it smells different, looks different, like it is different. So I definitely get more of like a sedating effect from like roaches and like ABV. Like actually out of all the edibles ever, I don't have it on hand anymore because I don't like dry herb vaping. But I've like, if anyone wants to send me their ABV, like, because I'm all about ABV edibles. Like if you dry herb vape and then whatever is left over at the end of it, you could just put that in chili, just throw it, like sprinkle it in a burger. Like you could just put that.
So easy to use. So easy.
That has a name now?
Already been vaped. That's just what I've been like used to describing it at. And yeah, so it's decarbed already. I mean, so like I love ABV edibles, but I've never really seen, I mean, it'd be hard for people to market them because I'm assuming the cannabinoid content is very low, right? So like it would, and also like the idea, how would you make ABV in a commercial? And the reason why it's not commercially viable is like to the extreme, but like I haven't seen it necessarily. And since I don't dry herb vape anymore, like I don't have access to it, but I've always been thinking like, it's been clear to me for a while now that cannabis, there's all these different ways that cannabis interacts with the brain, and that, you know, I am highly sensitive, not just to cannabis, but to kind of everything that goes in my brain. And so many of us are, right? And that all of these little nuances, if we could kind of piece together what makes them the most reproducible, that has been my focus for the last few years, is trying to make it reproducible, because that's part of what has made it a more reliable medicine for me, is to not have like an unexpected panic attack, or to not be unexpectedly not able to do an interview like this where I'm talking to you guys, you know, we're talking like being relaxed, but also being like coherent and like able to have somewhat linear trajectory. Like, I don't know if my thoughts are ever truly linear, but to have a more comprehensible thought pathway, and then the ability to communicate it, right? Like sort of like that, you know, that has enabled me to also have more confidence in cannabis as a medicine, and have more confidence in like even using it more reliably, right? Like, because it was like true that at some points earlier in my journey with using it medicinally, like I would be unexpectedly like wanting to play video games or like watch TV, or like, you know, just unexpectedly having like either bouts of like being not productive, which also there's a whole lot there to break down of why we always have to feel productive, etc. But like it is better in general for me to have it be like a reproducible experience. And I mean, that's not super unknown, given like that neurodivergent people can tend to like routine, predictability, and like an understanding of what the rest of the day looks like, and etc. And like, you know, that's been something that mixing the rare cannabinoids in and understanding more about terpenes, and also now understanding more about just like everything, has been helpful. And I mean, I've been like trying to think about it, like, yeah, so it's been 18 years that I've been using cannabis, and I mean, I'm still learning, and we're still changing, right? Like you mentioned, you've gone through something recently that's changed. Like all of us are going to change. Those of us who cycle hormonally have some major points of change that occur. If you have children, there's all these different, even stressful jobs, all sorts of things, weather, like the sunlight outside, like seasonal effectiveness exists. And like, there's all these changes that we are going through all the time that, you know, make the sort of constant evaluation of it necessary, in my opinion. And there are definitely days, like I'd say that in general, like I do lean towards the regular cycle where I'll use way more heavily on weekends or socially, etc. Like for social settings, I like to be at a way higher dose, like as high as possible, basically, depending on the social setting. But like if there's more than 10 people, like I'm having a way better time if I'm like heavily medicated, right? And like And I like socializing. So that like is, it's helpful in that way. And to know that then the next morning I wake up feeling better, and that there's this ebb and flow between the immediate effects of cannabis for me and the more long-term effects that kind of happen the next day, week over week of using it chronically. These are different levels of effects. And, in pharmacology, there are different mechanisms that are happening. It's the immediate drug interacting with the receptors versus the long-term changes in the receptor levels in your brain, the connectivity of different brain cells, et cetera, that happens over like a longer period of time of use.
So, piggybacking on that, you were talking about the impacts pharmacologically that were being caused with cannabis. In the survey that you did for neurodivergent people who came in and talked to you about it, were they disclosing just their symptoms, or were they talking about their use as well? I remember taking the quiz, and I remember I was like, I need more questions. There's so much more I can talk about.
I know it was such a quick baseline, but I definitely, in my own, like the point for me was like putting it out there, being like, let's talk about this concept that neurodivergent people use cannabis, right?
Two big fishes from it. Me and Jessica were like, yes.
It's so many people shared so much with me. And basically also neurodivergent people are the Canna nerds. Like we are within this realm of like, in general, neurodivergent people have thought a lot about our own brains, right? We've been forced to, kind of. And that meta-analysis lends itself to being able to look at cannabis in that way. And so, I listed a bunch of different cases that cannabis could help with, right? Like a bunch of different instances that people could use, like use cases for cannabis. Like, why do people use cannabis? Like the top 3 in any population is pain, anxiety, and sleep. That's just like across the board. And I think it's ridiculous that we don't talk about cannabis for mental health, and yet we know that cannabis is used for pain, anxiety, and sleep, because those 3 things are all implicitly part of mental health. Like they're all part of like this really complicated web. And one of the big statistics that didn't surprise me, but that was shocking to me, was that like over 85%, I think it was like 86.9% of neurodivergent respondents had other comorbid conditions. They had other like either like a physical pain condition or like an autoimmune condition or like a GI issue. And that cannabis isn't just about, for people who are neurodivergent, like cannabis isn't just about fixing, quote unquote, or like helping with some of the like classic neurodivergent things like baseline anxiety or social anxiety or like executive function or like productivity, linearity. Like it's also, which it does help with that, which was cool. It's a good percentage of people who use cannabis that benefit with focus and productivity and with like overstimulation or like sensory type needs. But it's not just that. It's because those same hypersensitivities in the brain will lead to other hypersensitivities like in your immune system regulation and in your inflammation, and will also be like affecting your GI system and like your GI motility. And so there's all of these other aspects of cannabis use that cannabis just in general helps with. And that, it's one of the things I've thought about for a long time, that cannabis's most useful thing is its blanket, blanket anti-inflammatory, just this huge anti-inflammatory potential across a lot of different areas of the body all over the place. And that, that's why it's so beneficial to have like topicals, to have edibles, to have suppositories, to have smoking and inhalation, to have all these different methods of administration, because everyone that is sensitive tends to have sensitivities elsewhere, and cannabis can be helpful in knocking out more than one of these things, right? It can kind of go through and knock it out. But no, I was mostly shocked by the written responses that I got. The level of depth that people have gone to tailor their cannabis use and their cannabinoid use to their own needs is amazing. And it's absolutely something that deserves to be highlighted. And it's something that needs to be understood within the scientific realm, because by understanding this, there's like universal accessibility and universal benefit, right? Like how if you put curb cuts into a sidewalk, it's not just going to help people in wheelchairs. It's also going to help moms with their strollers. It's also going to help people who have difficult, like people like older people who are starting to have difficulty walking. Like it makes it easier. So like installing ramps and curb cuts in that same way that helping, like it's designed to specifically help one population with disabilities, but it really ends up benefiting everyone. In that same way, you know, studying the neurodivergent population with cannabis will help everyone, because you'll help everyone else who is also on that same neurodivergent spectrum, just in the lesser areas or in a different like ability of flavor. Like let's say someone who's totally neurotypical, which I'm not even sure if that exists, but like let's just say that someone is completely neurotypical and they use cannabis and like they're sort of like using it recreationally or adult use, right? Like it's only useful in that social relaxation setting. Wouldn't it still be beneficial for that person to know the best thing for them? Like that would absolutely still benefit everyone. And part of how we could get there is to study people who are more sensitive to it. And that's just something that has made a lot of sense to me. And that the initial survey results, like the striking thing to me was all of the level of individual effort and personalization. Like I am just one of like so many people who has this like wealth of knowledge of the personal experience, and we just aren't valuing it. And I think that we definitely need to move towards having more value in it, in the lived experience of it, and also just in the documentation, right? Because we've never had access to it before, right? Like I've never actually had the right amount of access to monitor it until more recently, the more recent, like, I don't know, 5 to 7 years. And then once I was able to start monitoring my THC intake, I was like, oh yeah, not for me, all this THC. Like, but before that, like we didn't even have the access or the ability to. And it was sort of just like, yeah, like a brownie was a brownie, or you made a firecracker in the microwave and who knew how much of it decarboxylated. And, you know, like, it's just like, this is like a new era for us. And we can also make it a better medicine from understanding it. So that's definitely,
sorry.
I was just saying that's definitely been like one of the things I've been the most excited about, in terms of starting to share my story a little bit more, and then finding just like I always knew I wasn't alone necessarily, but I had always felt very alone in the experience. I felt very isolated, in my perspective of it. And I mean, from the academic and medical perspective of it, I've been called dangerous before, right? Like I've been called a dangerous perspective because the neurodivergent population is vulnerable, and because there are negative aspects that can come from overuse. So it's really complicated to talk about, but I'm the most excited about making a sort of like either like not even just a resource service, like, but just making it an awareness in general about like just how detailed you could get and how beneficial it is to get detailed about your use that way. Like how much benefit there is to understanding how the cannabinoids interact with you individually, and how much it can improve like your quality of life by increasing just in general your understanding of, because that understanding of cannabis will eventually go on. It typically goes on to expand. I mean, that was my entryway into thinking about a lot of other things. And I think that cannabis could be a great tool for that. And that for neurodivergent people who use cannabis already, to be able to like reevaluate that, in the context of like what other people are doing or have already done, so that we're not like just reinventing the wheel over and over again, is going to be a huge benefit. And I'm really excited to see where it goes. But mostly I'm just also excited I'm excited and grateful to be at a place and in a space where that's possible, because, you know, 20 or 30 years ago, this would not be the case, right? Like it wouldn't be safe to do.
No, you would have been completely ostracized 20 to 30 years ago. I know, because I was starting to smoke cannabis back then, because that's how old I am. So.
But it's also like to stand on the shoulders of that. Like I'm grateful. I would never be able to be here if it wasn't for that, if it wasn't for all the advocacy that went on earlier, if it wasn't for the legacy market persevering, right? Like,
wasn't for those brickweeds coming up from Mexico all the way to Virginia, we would not be here today. I know we're getting close on time. Jessica, did you want to have any questions before we wrap up?
No, I want to be respectful of everybody's time because we've been here a little bit over time because that's how good of a discussion this is. And I think, Miyabe, you touched on basically everything that I was curious about with your routine and speaking to how detailed you can get with your cannabis consumption when you understand what you're consuming and how well you can tailor that to your specific needs is endlessly fascinating to me. So thank you for sharing your time and your expertise with us because, oh, what a rich deep dive.
Yeah, no, thanks for having this conversation with me. This has been so great. This is literally just my favorite topic to talk about in general, because I think it doesn't get enough attention because people are scared to talk about it. And like, it is scary to talk about because mental health can be extreme and people can be volatile. And so like, no advice is given. Right. I'm not a medical professional. Like, this is not medical advice. It's just experience mixed with theoretical. And like, in general, it seems that like the more people start viewing things this way, their use practices fall in line. Like, people's use practices tend to become more when you have this like medical intention and you start actually understanding that context. In general, like, use practice is more controlled, and that like is always going to be safer. And so that's always kind of my take home at the end of it for everyone is like, well, why do you, I mean, even with like saying, like, talking to youth, right? Talking to people who are younger, like, well, why do you like weed? Like, if I could go back and ask myself something when I was a teenager and like, hopefully profoundly make some sort of shift, but who knows? But I'd just be like, probably not, because I'm a teenager, but I'd just be like, like, why? Like, why do you like it? And then to go back and be able to think about it and be like, oh, I like it because it's helping me with X, Y, and Z. It's like, okay, yeah. And then like, at what point is that a detriment? And recognizing that it exists for everyone. There's a point, and it's different for all of us. I'm just really happy to like be having these conversations, and that we're reaching a point where we can have them, and feel able to talk about it, and like coming out of the closet of cannabis, like,
that
like,
green closet.
I used to call it the cannabis closet.
Yeah.
And that really is what it feels like. And I think people like you and Jessica, we have to, stand up and be proud of the fact that we've recognized the wonders of this plant, that we understand also that there can be detriments to using it improperly, just like everything out there, right? You mentioned sugar causes cancer earlier, and we don't see people out there outlawing sugar and on the contrary.
Quite the opposite.
Yeah, quite the opposite, actually.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And I mean, the last thing I guess I would say about quality of cannabis and like quality of medical cannabis is that I really hope that we start to really focus and evaluate on that for the neurodivergent population. That is one of my other big like goals with continuing to do like research and outreach within the neurodivergent population. Like, my first goal needs to be education, because the prohibition, there's such a lack of education. And then like from there, like we should be focusing on designing and figuring out quality of medicine, like for like specific needs. It doesn't even have to be like in general, like this one is for neurodivergent people. It could be like this one, it like what we already know necessarily is that some of us react differently to other things, but just like in general, like what is the most tame version of something? And it could be an ancient like combination that is low in THC.
Yeah.
Right. It could be a combination that we've never bred before. It could be something that's moderate in THC, but that has like really high, like we always know that it has to be balanced with anthocyanins. Or it could be something that, recently last year, I saw a poster presentation on molecules that we never quantify, but that are present in outdoor grows that aren't present in indoor grows, right? Things of different sunlight, like things of things that are grown in different sun, like like light spectrums and things that are grown in living soil versus things that are grown into like, so there's all these new, and people are doing this like research qualitatively and in there in the industry, and like the quality is coming out. It's just like understanding that in the context for me of my specific interest of like how that interacts with the brain.
Yeah.
Is something that I'm really hopeful for. And I think we're getting there. So this is like, something to be excited about.